Hello, Samuel McVicker here, editor of Sibylline's podcast. Just a quick note before we jump into this episode. We're going to start posting these analyst roundtables on the What Just Happened channel. These will be slightly different from our usual episodes. They are just designed to be slightly longer, give the analysts an opportunity to dive deeper into broader trends around geopolitical trends and flashpoints. So if you enjoy these, please let us know by liking and subscribing. And with that said, here is Louis Galvin, head of the Americas desk, with his colleagues discussing Venezuela and the aftermath of Maduro's capture. Enjoy.
Today, we're going to be taking a look at the aftermath of the situation in Venezuela following the US's military operation on the 3rd of January and digging into some of the implications that this could have for the wider region. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues Brady, our principal analyst for North America, and Alex Marciniak, our intelligence analyst for Latin America and the Caribbean. So Alex, I think we'll start with you, and I think the best place to launch this episode of the podcast is looking at what happened. So, of course, we've already covered Venezuela in quite a lot of detail, but essentially, can you just recount exactly what we saw on the 3rd of January and where we're at now with the situation?
Sure, will do, and thanks for having me on the podcast yet again. So to give a really quick précis, on the 3rd of January, the US conducted a military operation which involved airstrikes on multiple positions in the Venezuelan capital, Caracas, some other parts of the country, mainly targeting military infrastructure, under the cover of these strikes, taking out sort of air defense systems and other military positions. Elements of the US Special Forces conducted a raid on President Maduro, the former president of Venezuela's residence, extracted him and his wife and brought them to the United States, and they're currently being held in New York City. This was done under the guise of capturing an indicted person. Maduro was indicted under several drug trafficking charges, where he'll be charged in the US forthcoming.
Thanks, Alex. And I think this operation kind of shocked a lot of people, especially the nature of it and the relative success of the operation as well. And I think one element that people aren't talking about so much is actually how this has gone down in the US and what the domestic reaction has been. So, Claire, what have you been seeing domestically at home in the aftermath of this Venezuela operation?
Yeah, sure. So in the immediate aftermath, it was a pretty mixed bag. There was a vocal minority that really uh, derided the operation for, perceived imperialist aims, and, spoke out that the U.S. should not be involved so heavily in another country's governance. There was also another vocal minority, that stated Maduro was a dictator, he was a bad guy, and he needed out, and that's what Trump did. But I would say the majority of the US population was just a bit confused, unsure, what really the implications were for the US and how this impacted, their day-to-day lives, and just overall a bit unaware of what really was even happening in Venezuela. And these kind of sects also apply to Trump's own MAGA base as well. There was, of course, a group that it was very supportive of him, but there was also a vocal group that questioned, how was this operation, America first? What does this give the American people? And then, of course, we also saw in Congress, the Democrats specifically were very frustrated with the fact that the Trump administration did not seek approval for the operation and also did not even notify Congress until it was already happening. I will say, though, now that a bit of time has passed, criticism has largely been muted by the overall operational success of the mission. The fact that there were no fatalities on the US side, that we haven't seen any large scale violence erupt in Venezuela. And moreover, the populace, their attention has been drawn by other domestic events, specifically the fatal shooting of a woman in Minneapolis by an immigration and customs enforcement agent, and also another shooting by immigration personnel in Portland, Oregon. So the population has already kind of shifted its attention away from Venezuela, and it's unlikely to really be pulled back there unless we see some new big development.
Thanks, Claire. And I think, yeah, it's a really important angle that I think, like I mentioned, is often being overlooked, is that domestic reaction in the US. I'm sure it has raised a lot of questions about the future of US foreign policy, which perhaps we can dig into a little bit later. For now, Alex, I'm going to come back to you. So, of course, in the aftermath of the operation, actually on the 4th of January, we put out a special report looking at the future for Venezuela and Venezuela's options going forward. And of course, we set out several scenarios in that report. So for our listeners, could you please recount what our scenarios were, what the state of play is in Venezuela at the moment, and what the situation is looking like going forward?
Yeah, so as we see it, there are three broad scenarios for the future of Venezuela in the coming sort of weeks, days, and months, or the short term. Scenario one is a scenario in which we see a democratic transition. So the current acting president of Venezuela, President Delcy Rodriguez, cooperates fully with the Trump administration on oil, other concessions, on domestic policy such as prisoner releases, such as opening up the economy, etc. And we ultimately see her step aside and let a democratic government come in place following successful elections. The second scenario would be the inverse. So the current regime in Venezuela does not cooperate with the US, trying to box the US out of oil investments, trying to maintain its grip on power by repressing the opposition, by repressing political dissidents, and turning to the US as adversaries for support. And then the third scenario, which we view as the most likely and the current track that we're on in this sort of week and a half that we've seen post sort of the dust settling from Operation Absolute Resolve, is a sort of middle way. So the President Delcy Rodriguez cooperates just enough with the US to, one, delay the prospect of further strikes, but also receive enough support, enough backing to maintain her position, and enough security guarantees that other actors within the Venezuelan state don't try and push her out. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing movement on the oil front. We're seeing talks about future oil investments. We've seen limited political prisoner releases, and we're seeing sustained dialogue, and even US President Trump himself saying that a so-called second wave of strikes on Venezuela need not be necessary for the short term. And that's where we see things going. So no sort of democratic transition just yet, but limited stability, at least for the time being. But obviously this is all subject to change, and we're monitoring it really closely.
Thanks, Alex. And yeah, very right to mention, I think those scenarios appear to be holding up at the moment, and interesting to really dig into what is going on in Venezuela on the ground now. I suppose that's a good segue into my next question. Why did this happen? We've seen oil in the headlines. Oil has kind of been dominating the headlines, but of course, we've discussed extensively issues around drug trafficking, immigration flows, etc. So could you dig into that a little bit? And if it is oil, what's happening on that front?
Yeah, great question. So I think this is a very nuanced issue, and a lot of people will point to one prevailing motivation above the rest, but I think it's our assessment that it's a whole host of issues. So obviously the legal justification was through the drug trafficking lens, calling President Maduro and some of his high command members of the Cartel de los Soles organized crime group. And while there is some drug trafficking out of Venezuela, and there is indeed organized crime elements within the Venezuelan state, and also the Venezuelan state protecting various armed actors such as the ELN, such as illegal miners, it's unlikely that this operation would have a significant impact on drug trafficking flows, given that Venezuela is not a serious exporter or producer of cocaine or other drugs in the region. Oil is certainly one of the issues that we're looking at closely, and was likely a large motivator for Trump himself. Obviously, Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves of any country in the world. However, oil was already moving. The US oil supermajor Chevron already operates a license, albeit under some restrictions at the moment, but oil was already moving from Venezuela to the US and other places around the world. Equally, following the US's new national security strategy released sort of at the tail end of last year, this idea of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, so Trump trying to box out any adversarial influence in the region, such as Iran, such as Russia, such as China, all these issues likely play a part in the broader picture of why this operation took place. As we've seen in plenty of different cases in the past sort of 12, 13 months, the Trump administration can want lots of things at once and use many different ways to get after this. We've seen in Mexico that, the Trump administration wants several security and migration outcomes, and it's happy to use other levers to do this, whether that be economic measures, whether that be political measures, whether that even be sort of security pressure as well. And I see it the same way here in Venezuela. There are lots of different outcomes that the Trump administration is after, and the use of military force was the way they chose for this, and they framed it through the drug trafficking position because that was the best way for them to get legal justification to carry out this operation. Also, I think one really important thing to reference here is while Venezuela might not be a significant drug moving country at the moment, there are other countries in the region where the US would like to stop and hamper drug movements, most notably in Mexico and Colombia. And we'll obviously get onto this later on in the podcast. But I think that what this Venezuela operation also does, in addition to, putting a more amenable regime in place in Venezuela and getting rid of an indicted person, is it acts as an example for other countries in the region of what the Trump administration is capable of doing and the lengths that it will go to achieve its goals, especially when it comes to drug trafficking. So Colombia and Mexico, are likely considering their options at the moment, and we'll get to that later on. And then turning to your oil question, we've seen some movement on the oil front so far. We've seen large, top-level discussions between the Trump administration and oil super majors. At the moment, we're also likely in the coming days and weeks going to see expanded licenses for existing oil firms there. So Chevron, notably, perhaps other oil companies as well, like Repsol, that operate in Venezuela. But in the sort of short to medium term, it's unlikely that we're going to see a significant increase in oil investments or a significant improvement to oil infrastructure. For the past sort of 15, 20 years or so, oil infrastructure in Venezuela has been severely hamstrung by internal issues, poor quality infrastructure, poor quality maintenance. So it's unlikely that we're going to see that change. And couple this with the ongoing political instability. As we mentioned, these scenarios that we outlined in the report from a couple of weeks ago are still subject to plenty of change, and the administration in Venezuela is far from secure. And it's really likely that most oil companies are going to want to wait for some indication that we're down a certain track, down a certain scenario before they fully get involved in Venezuela, because, albeit these companies will likely have a high risk appetite, this is probably beyond most companies willing to invest and put personnel on the ground and put their money in Venezuela. So look for increasing licenses in the short term, but in the longer term, we'll wait and see to see how much uptick there is in this oil investment.
Absolutely, and I think you're right to flag, Alex, the kind of short term and longer term things to keep an eye out, because ultimately this is a long term issue and a long term project for whomever wants to get involved in Venezuela. And I think you're right. Yeah, initially we might be seeing those expanded licenses for the firms like Chevron and those who had their licenses suspended last year, like Repsol, like ENI. And I think as well, it was really important to highlight that this US administration can want multiple things at once. And I think that's going to be really important and something that Sibylline are going to be looking at really closely as we assess implications for other countries, not just within our region, but around the world. And I think that's a useful starting point for us to look at what Trump's foreign policy is and what the foreign policy is going to look like going forward, because I think Venezuela was a bit of a watershed moment in US foreign policy. So Claire, what are your insights into the future of US foreign policy under this administration?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you said, the operation in Venezuela really solidified what the Trump administration laid out in its national security strategy, and Alex already mentioned, in which it stated that the U.S. is going to prioritize protecting its interests and security in its own hemisphere, which is obviously a bit different from what we've seen in the past decade. So this will primarily mean working to dismantle drug trafficking operations, address unauthorized migration, and also, as we've stated, removing Chinese, Russian, and Iranian influence from the hemisphere. And of course, all of this is dictated by what the US thinks it can get out of these situations. And of course, that doesn't mean that China and Iran and, other adversarial actors are no longer issues for the Trump administration. As we've said, the U.S. can want multiple things at once. It has ample resources and ample reach to, address multiple issues across multiple parts of the globe. But like I said, we're going to be seeing a new focus on Latin America and the Arctic, for example, unlike what Americans are used to seeing, which is why Alex rightly pointed out that nations like Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, are now a bit more nervous because the Trump administration has very clearly shown that it is going to be turning a lot more attention to issues in this part of the world. And of course, Venezuela also showed how the Trump administration is likely to conduct that type of business. Um, so far, the Trump administration, has really used assertive and, almost aggressive rhetoric. It prefers to handle things bilaterally between nations. It does not like multilateral approaches. And in this regard, often international norms are not adhered to. Um, and Trump is very willing to utilize both punitive economic measures like sanctions and tariffs, of course, but he's also willing to flex U.S. military might. And this is not only against, traditional adversaries, but also even against allies. Like we've seen him threaten Greenland, which is obviously an ally of the US. But because, as I said, there is this new shift on hemispheric security, and that includes the Arctic, really military might can be used even against traditional allies. Not that it's a likely scenario, but just the threat of it can now be utilized. Um, the last thing I'll just say on this, I think Venezuela also demonstrated that the Trump administration doesn't want to build countries. It's not interested in the nation building business, and it's happy to work with, whoever might be in charge, as long as it feels that that leader is amenable and will, bend the knee per se, which is why, we saw Maduro get removed, but his regime at the moment is still.
Excellent. I think, yeah, that's a great overview of where foreign policy is headed under this administration. And a couple of countries that you mentioned there, we can dig into. Greenland, of course, another one that's on everyone's radar. And this week, we're working with our Europe colleagues to produce a report looking at implications for Greenland. So do keep an eye out for that over the next week or so. And the other countries that I think all of us have mentioned at least one point so far in the podcast, it's maybe time to pull the trigger and have a look at them. So, Alex, Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, perhaps Panama as well. What does the operation in Venezuela mean for these countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important question, and a lot of people have been asking these questions to us for the past couple of weeks. So I'll start with Mexico. One of the US's largest trading partner, Mexico's largest trading partner in turn. So the current administration in Mexico, led by President Claudia Sheinbaum, has done almost everything that she can to prove that she is on side with President Trump and that she is on side with, cracking down on organized crime and cartels, cracking down on irregular migration, and also decreasing sanction avoidance and compliance with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement as well by recently putting tariffs on Chinese imports. For instance, in the past year, we've seen numerous security crackdowns along the US-Mexico border by Mexican security forces. We've seen increases in fentanyl lab clearances in northern Mexico. We've seen a drastic reduction in border encounters by the Customs and Border Patrol on the US side of the border as well. So what this operation means is it's another layer of pressure by the Trump administration on the Sheinbaum administration to keep up these operations, if not escalate them. What we'll likely see in the coming months, is increasing cooperation between the Mexican authorities and the US authorities. So what could this look like? Intelligence sharing, increasing joint task forces, increasing US training and advisories of security personnel, including as well increasing Mexican authorities requesting, for instance, US drone flyovers of Mexican territory. We've seen that happen once, at least once in the past year, over sort of Mexico state in Mexico. We've seen reports of US spy planes operating in border regions over cartel territory. So this is like what we're going to see in the coming months. But every time we've seen Trump and Sheinbaum have talks, have negotiations, it's always worked out pretty well for Sheinbaum. She seems to have the magic bullet when it comes to talking Trump down from the highest points of escalation. And there's no reason to see this will change in the coming months. But all we'll likely see is this operation push Sheinbaum to push that needle a little bit further when it comes to collaborating with the US. However, she has maintained from sort of day one and even till now that the primacy of Mexican sovereignty. So we're unlikely at this point to see, or highly unlikely to see, unilateral military action. I think in the greatest case of escalation, there's a realistic possibility that Mexico requests US assistance in the sense of requesting US strikes on Mexican territory directed by Mexican authorities, so maintaining as much control over it as possible. So just to recap on that, the most likely case is this increasing security cooperation. A realistic possibility of, if there are escalations, that Mexico requests US assistance, possibly leading to some sort of US conducted, Mexican directed strikes, and then a highly unlikely scenario where the US conducts unilateral action as if it sees that Mexico is completely unable to combat drug trafficking, and it views Morena Sheinbaum's party in Congress as compromised by organized crime groups, for instance. So that's the sort of broad picture that we have for the coming months and years for Mexico. Colombia is slightly different. So historically, over the past sort of 12, 13 months, President Trump and Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, have had a pretty adversarial relationships. They've had numerous spats on X, formerly Twitter. Even when Petro visited New York for the UN General Assembly, he was kicked out of the US for antagonizing Trump as well. So they've had a pretty difficult relationship. And immediately following the Venezuela operation, we were pretty concerned that we'd see escalations in Colombia. However, immediately following this operation, Petro looked to de-escalate the situation, and there was a détente between Trump and Petro. There was a productive phone call. Petro has now been invited to the White House to talk about this further. We're seeing talks and seeing rumors of joint US and Colombian military operations to combat the ELN, the National Liberation Army, a guerrilla group in Colombia. So we're likely going to see this, again, same with Mexico, increasing security cooperation, but I think it's more likely that we see US action in Colombia, such as, strikes at the request of the Colombian authorities, joint operations on the ground as well. One thing to really watch in the coming months with Colombia is that there's a general election in a few months. We'll likely see a pivot towards a more center or more right candidate if the current polling holds and current public opinion holds. At this point, it becomes even more likely that this sort of new president will be more amenable to the Trump administration, decreasing these risks of political disagreements and, seeing more US involvement on the ground. What does this mean for sort of businesses and people operating on the ground? Likely very little for most businesses operating in cities. A lot of these operations would happen in very rural locations, sort of along the Venezuela-Colombia border in Norte de Santander department, and also sort of near the Ecuadorian border in Nariño department and Cauca and Valle del Cauca departments as well. So while we're likely to see some escalations there, it's unlikely to have a significant impact on business operations, at least in sort of medium term. Turning to Cuba, we have seen significant messaging by the Trump administration that Cuba is ripe to fall. I somewhat doubt these assertions. We've seen reports of CIA assessments saying that Cuba isn't on the verge of collapse, while the halting of Venezuelan oil exports to Cuba will certainly have significant impacts for sort of energy security in Cuba. I mean, they already struggled to keep the lights on at the best of times. It's probably only going to get worse. There's no significant indication that the Communist Party, which has been in power for sort of 70, 80 years, they've weathered worse storms in the past. The one thing I would make sure to look at is, as a trigger warning and indicator, is the messaging by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He is widely seen as a Cuba hawk. So if he is increasing his rhetoric on Cuba, that might be an indication that we're going into a more diverging scenario. And then lastly, we'll touch on Panama. So at the start of the Trump administration, there was lots of messaging about Trump retaking the Panama Canal. And again, people are talking once again about where does Panama fit into this picture. We see it as highly unlikely to a remote possibility that the Trump administration carries out any action in Panama. President Mulino, the president in Panama, has been incredibly receptive to the Trump administration. He has signed legislation which has been very unpopular in Panama to increase US military presence in the region. This has been detrimental to his own popularity, but he's done this to try and signal to the Trump administration that, look, we're on side. The situation with the Panama Canal is broadly out of the Panamanian authorities' hands. It's currently within sort of purchasing and the private companies involved in the Panama Canal dock purchases at the moment. So the US invading or conducting military action in Panama itself doesn't change the situation a great deal for the time being. Also, in terms of drug trafficking flows, drugs do transit through the Panama Canal significantly, but along land routes, it's again a bit more limited. So we're less concerned about Panama than we are, say, looking at the current drivers in Mexico and Colombia, for instance.
Thanks, Alex. And I think the best summary from that as well is just showing how many different drivers there are and how each country in the region has different issues and situations that the Trump administration is going to have to navigate around as it's trying to assert its foreign policy. Of course, we have plenty of pain points that the desk are going to be looking at very closely over the coming weeks and months. We've got USMCA negotiations coming up, for example. So a lot of pressure points for us to keep an eye on, and things that we'll be routinely monitoring and reporting on as well. I think lastly, the final, important thing to take a look at for us in this podcast is the reaction from Venezuela's allies. We know Venezuela had deep ties with particularly Russia, particularly China as well. Russia was the primary supplier of military assistance and air defense systems, and China was Venezuela's largest buyer of oil. Perhaps the silence is deafening, but Claire, what's your take on the reaction from these states?
Yeah, it was a big concern from a lot of people in the immediate aftermath of the operation. But ultimately, the response from both Russia and China was quite muted. I think while the loss of an ally is obviously not ideal, neither nation really lost enough in resources or any other type of monetary value to really trigger any drastic escalation. The closest thing we came to a rise in tensions was probably on January 7th when the US and also UK forces seized a Russian flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic Ocean near Iceland. There were reports that Russian military vessels were in the vicinity when the US seized the ship. But in the end, the only response from Russia was just rhetorical, and this kind of lowered the risk of any significant escalation. Now, in response to this incident, and even the Venezuela operation, if Russia does want to send some type of signal, it is very likely that they will do so within the theater of war in Ukraine and not, in or around Venezuela. So luckily, we haven't seen any, drastic U.S.-Russia, escalations coming out of this situation. Similar with China, a lot of people were concerned that China may try to increase its cyber operations against the U.S., but there was no indications that that occurred. And there has also been no, diplomatic disruptions to the ongoing U.S. and China trade negotiations as well. So all of that said, with both of these, superpowers, they kind of, for lack of a better term, just turned a blind eye to this situation. And basically, in their calculuses, Venezuela was not worth, poking at the U.S.
Thanks, Claire. And yeah, I think very, very telling there responses or lack thereof, and certainly something that we're going to have to keep a closer eye on as we, or as the US starts engaging in other theatres, both economically and perhaps militarily as well. Claire, Alex, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for the insight and, of course, all the hard work that you guys and our other Americas colleagues and our broader regional analysts are doing here at Sibylline. So we've referenced throughout the podcast our coverage on a lot of the countries that have been mentioned. So Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, and, of course, Greenland. And if our listeners are interested in accessing those reports, which will be coming out over the next few weeks, please get in touch at info@sibylline.co.uk, and we can make that happen for you. Otherwise, thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.